February 1945. A contested field near Prüm, Germany. Snow covers the frozen mud where 5 dead American soldiers lie scattered after a brutal firefight. An American recovery team moves cautiously onto the field to collect their fallen comrades. A medic kneels beside the first body, reaching down to roll it over and check the dog tags. Suddenly, a voice cuts through the freezing air, shouting for him to stop. An engineer has spotted a thin, metallic glint in the slush. A hair-thin tripwire runs from under the dead soldier's torso directly to the pin of a hidden grenade. The bodies of the dead are no longer just casualties. They are active weapons, rigged to kill the very men who came to bring them home. General George S. Patton will soon discover this ultimate violation of battlefield honor, and his response will change how the Third Army handles the fallen forever. This is the story of what happened when German forces weaponized the fallen, and how General Patton met this ultimate battlefield transgression with cold, administrative fury. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the truth buried under the rubble of retreat. Corporal Jimmy Tsao was 23 years old, born and raised in the crowded neighborhoods of San Francisco, California. He served as a combat engineer attached to the frontline recovery teams of the Third Army. Before the war, he worked with his father in a small repair shop, a job that demanded patience, steady fingers, and an absolute eye for tiny mechanical defects. He enlisted because he wanted to prove his place in the country he called home. But the European theater had already cost him his closest childhood friend outside Bastogne. That loss made the duty of recovering the dead deeply personal to him. He viewed bringing fallen boys back to their families as a sacred obligation, a quiet promise kept between soldiers on the line. Now, his sharp eyes and mechanical intuition were the only things standing between his squad and sudden annihilation on a frozen hill. Feldwebel Horst Brandt was 30 years old, a career pioneer sergeant from Hanover, Germany, who viewed the battlefield through a lens of cold, mechanical efficiency. He grew up under the strict, unyielding discipline of Prussian military tradition and fully embraced the ideology that total war justified any means necessary to halt the Allied advance. Brandt prided himself on his professional precision, a trait reflected in his spotless, tailored field uniform and the glinting iron cross pinned squarely to his tunic. He had spent years learning the intricate art of delay traps, specifically designed to bypass the fighting infantry and strike the vulnerable support personnel who followed behind. To Brandt, a corpse was not a human being deserving of dignity, but a tactical opportunity, an ideal anchor for an explosive trap. He felt a sense of professional satisfaction as he used the Americans' own discarded grenades to rig the 5 bodies, turning their own equipment into a final, lethal surprise for the recovery teams. By February 1945, the landscape of Western Europe had turned into a vast, freezing wasteland of mud and shattered concrete. The German war machine was fracturing, pushed back toward its own borders by the relentless momentum of the Allied advance. Supply lines were shattered, communications were failing, and the German High Command faced an absolute shortage of fuel, ammunition, and fresh manpower. In this desperate atmosphere of collapse, tactical discipline among the retreating units began to fray, giving way to unconventional and increasingly brutal methods of delay. Many frontline Allied officers encountered these erratic defensive tactics and frequently chose to overlook minor infractions, viewing them simply as the chaotic reality of a collapsing enemy army. The chaotic retreat created a lawless vacuum on the edges of the battlefield, where standard military conventions were abandoned in favor of raw survival. In earlier campaigns, isolated instances of irregular warfare had been dismissed by commanders as desperate measures taken by disorganized troops trying to buy time to escape. But as the fighting entered the dense forests and old border towns near the Siegfried Line, these desperate measures ceased to be random and became part of a deliberate, organized pattern of terror. The retreating forces began utilizing highly specialized technical traps designed specifically to inflict maximum psychological damage on the advancing units. These operations were no longer carried out by panicked infantrymen acting on survival instincts, but by trained specialists executing precise defensive strategies. The fields around the border towns were transformed into intricate networks of hidden hazards, where even the act of clearing the field became an engagement with an unseen, hostile force. The recovery teams moving behind the advance were entering a landscape intentionally rigged to destroy them. The situation on the frozen field near Prüm had escalated far beyond the typical hazards of a winter advance. The American infantry captain looked down at the 5 bodies laid out near the edge of the clearing, his face pale against the winter chill. He turned to the captured German pioneer sergeant, who stood quietly under the guard of 2 riflemen, his hands folded neatly behind his back. The captain asked him if he was the one who had rigged the fallen men with tripwires. Brandt did not look away, answering calmly that he was indeed the engineer responsible for securing the sector before the withdrawal. The captain raised his voice slightly, asking if the sergeant understood that those were dead men, soldiers who had already surrendered their lives in open combat. Brandt replied that a battlefield did not change its nature, simply because a soldier stopped breathing. He stated that the bodies were left in an area where an advancing force would naturally congregate, making them ideal placement points for defensive delay measures. The captain stared at him, incredulous, and asked if he felt no shame in using a soldier's fallen comrades to murder the men trying to carry them home. Brandt tilted his chin up, his polished boots gleaming in the gray daylight, and remarked that war was not a game of chivalry played by schoolboys. He told the captain that the German army was fighting for the survival of the fatherland, and that sentimentality over corpses was a luxury only the winning side could afford. He added that the American equipment found on the dead was highly effective, and it would have been a waste of perfectly good ordnance not to employ it against the support elements following the infantry. The captain told him that his actions violated every standard of civilized warfare recognized by decent nations. Brandt laughed softly, a dry sound that cut through the cold air, and said that standard rules disappeared when an army was defending its own soil. He stated that his duty was to delay the enemy by any means available, and that the emotional attachment Americans felt for their dead made those dead an excellent tactical vulnerability. The captain realized that the sergeant felt absolutely no remorse, viewing the entire operation as a brilliant textbook exercise in combat engineering. He knew this calculation went far beyond the authority of a company commander to handle. He told the guards to keep the sergeant isolated, under heavy guard, and to touch absolutely nothing on the field until higher headquarters arrived. He stepped back to his command vehicle and immediately opened a direct line to the rear. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep pulled directly onto the frozen field, the engine cutting out against the sharp winter wind. 4 stars glinted clearly on his helmet. The famous ivory-handled revolvers rested quietly on his belt. Every soldier in the clearing immediately snapped to attention, their eyes fixed on the general as he stepped down into the slush. Patton walked with a slow, deliberate stride, his expression completely unreadable, cold as the German mud. He bypassed the captain entirely and walked straight to where the captured pioneer sergeant stood waiting under guard. Patton studied him. The general stood less than 2 feet away, his gaze moving over the German's immaculate uniform and the polished metal of his iron cross. Patton asked him if he was the officer who had personally rigged the 5 American bodies with tripwires. Brandt tightened his posture and answered that he had performed his duties according to his engineering training. Patton asked him if he had used American ordnance, taken from the pockets and webbing of those dead soldiers to build the traps. Brandt replied that he had utilized the available resources on the field to ensure maximum efficiency. Patton asked a final question, his voice dropping to a sharp whisper, inquiring if the sergeant believed that a man who died in battle should be turned into an explosive device to slaughter his friends. Brandt smiled faintly and stated that in total war, a body was simply terrain to be altered for defense. Patton looked past him at the frozen ground. He said that a soldier fights the living, not the dead, he remarked. That when a man falls in battle, his conflict with the world is finished, and his remains belong to his country, not to an engineer's workshop. He stated that the Third Army had encountered many varieties of stubborn resistance, but that desecrating the fallen was the behavior of a cornered animal, not a disciplined military professional. He pointed toward the edge of the clearing, where the recovery team stood waiting with their tools. He told the sergeant that the American corporal from San Francisco had spent 2 agonizing hours on his belly, disarming those traps, risking his life to correct a cowardly act. He informed Brandt that his professional engineering skills would now be put to an immediate practical test on this very field. He offered the German a final absolute choice. He could walk out onto the remaining uncleared sections of the sector and personally sweep every square yard for hidden mines, or he could be tied to a wooden post in front of the entire division as a documented war criminal. Brandt looked at the general's cold eyes, his calculated arrogance suddenly evaporating into the freezing air, and gave a stiff, silent nod of compliance. The punishment was carried out immediately before the assembled units of the infantry division. 2 American engineers stood guard with their rifles leveled as Feldwebel Horst Brandt dropped to his knees in the freezing mud, his hands shaking as he pulled a heavy iron mine detector from the back of the utility truck. The pristine fabric of his tailored uniform was quickly soaked through with icy slush, and the glinting iron cross on his chest dragged through the dirt as he crawled forward on his stomach. He was forced to sweep the exact snowy field where he had left his lethal traps, his face inches away from the hidden dangers buried in the frozen ground. The gathered American soldiers watched in complete silence, their faces grim as they stood over the bodies of their fallen comrades. Brandt could hear the low hum of the detector in his ears, every click of the machinery sounding like a countdown to his own destruction. He could smell the bitter scent of wet earth and cordite as he carefully brushed away the snow from a buried pressure plate, knowing that a single lapse in his concentration would mean his death. The arrogant composure he had maintained during his interrogation was completely gone, replaced by the raw, desperate focus of a man trapped in his own design. Corporal Jimmy Tsao returned home to San Francisco, California. After the Allied victory in Europe, he quietly reopened the small repair shop with his father, his steady fingers working on delicate commercial instruments instead of lethal tripwires. He lived a long, peaceful life in the city by the bay, rarely speaking to his family about the freezing mud of the German borderlands, and passed away quietly in 1988. The memory of that snowy field near Prüm remained with him, only in the silent care he took with every piece of machinery he touched. Feldwebel Horst Brandt survived his forced sweep of the sector and was transferred to a secure detention facility for senior Axis prisoners. He faced in military tribunal during the post-war trials of 1946, where his detailed construction of delay traps was submitted as formal evidence of battlefield desecration. He served a sentence of 12 years before being released, returning to a heavily rebuilt Hanover, where he worked as a civil surveyor until his quiet death in 1974. He remained bitter about his captured status until the end, often complaining to his former comrades that the Americans had violated engineering protocol by making him clear his own defensive works. General George S. Patton never mentioned the booby-trapped bodies in his public briefings or his post-war press conferences. He kept the engineering report locked securely inside his personal desk, alongside the intelligence files slated for the war crimes documentation units. In a private letter written to his wife in late February, he remarked that the true test of an army was how it treated the helpless, noting that an enemy who weaponized the dead had already lost the moral right to be called soldiers. Some historians have argued that General Patton's decision to force a captured prisoner to clear a live minefield was a direct violation of international conventions regarding the treatment of prisoners of war. They contend that using captives for hazardous labor constituted an illegal battlefield execution without due process. Others have argued the opposite, defending the action as a necessary command decision designed to protect his own recovery teams from systemic illegal desecration. They maintain that the immediate tactical threat required an extraordinary response to preserve military discipline. What is certain is that after this confrontation, the Third Army instituted a mandatory engineer sweep for all fallen personnel, establishing a permanent operational protocol that prioritized the safety of support troops during the final advance into Germany. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have left the prisoner to standard military tribunals? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the truth buried under the rubble of retreat, make sure to subscribe.